Hello, welcome to your CNET 204 Week 11 video. This week we're going to look at an introduction to PHP and HTML forms because it helps to know server-side scripting to parse a form. This week we're going to look at what a form is, different types of input fields, some that are new to HTML5, what PHP is. We're going to creating your first PHP script. We're going to look at using PHP variables and how to parse and validate a form, very simplified with PHP. We're not going to get crazy with validation. So let's start at the beginning. What's a form? HTML forms, are used to collect user input. And then it's sent to the server to be processed. Anytime you've entered data into a web page on the internet, you've used a form. For things like using a search engine. And when you go to Google and Google something, that's a form. When you're logging into a web-based service, like Facebook or Gmail or Twitter or anything, anywhere you're entering in information, that's a form. Registering a new account for a website, you've filled out a form and hit a submit button. And anytime you order something on the internet, like pizza or something off Amazon, you're using a form. Now, forms require a server-side script to be processed on the server. This is usually written in a language like PHP. I mentioned PHP a bit because it's one of the most popular ones. And that's the one we're doing this week anyway, right? That's why we're doing it. It's one of the most popular ones. Forms can be submitted using two methods, get or post. When you submit a form using get, the data from the form is sent in the packet header, and it's visible in the address field. This should never be used if you're dealing with sensitive data. You tend to only want to use this if you're implementing some sort of search engine or search-like feature. When you submit a form using post, however, the data is sent in the body of the packet. So it's not visible in the address field. It's not encrypted. It's just not visible in the address field. And you can specify which method you want this sent as, or want the form to use to send the data to the server, as an attribute in the opening form tag. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So now that we know what a form is, we know that it needs to be parsed with some PHP, and we're going to touch on that later. What does a form contain? Well, it contains a bunch of input fields for different formats, for dealing with data in different formats. For example, text fields. These will appear and accept plain text data. Password fields, you'll get dots or obscured when you input your password. It's not encrypted, it's just hidden. Just want to point that out, it's just hidden. A radio will display a radio button. Use this for when you want a single input selection. That's a little filled in circle that you've seen. That's what it's called, it's a radio button. Checkbox displays a checkbox. You tend to use this for anything that has 0 or more choices, so you might have more than one. Otherwise, use a radio. Submit will display a submit button, which will submit the form to the server for processing, if you've included a server-side script and the name of that in this, which we're going to do this week. And reset, which will clear all of the data on the form, which could be a useful thing. Now, any of the data that's submitted by the user to the form should be validated by a server-side script before connecting to a database and doing something. Validating data is part of processing the form because you can't trust anything has been entered correctly, and you also need to ensure that it hasn't been tampered with en route. So you validate it. Now, we're not going to be doing any database stuff with our form because that's a bit more complicated and outside of the scope of this course. But we are going to write some PHP to parse our form. Now HTML5 added several new input types to improve data submission and validation. Some of these are things like the date input type, which allows you to choose a date through a pop-up calendar in your browser. You've probably seen these in use. Email is used to validate an email at least through HTML on the client side. And again, that's a useful thing because validating an email address is a bit tricky. And we should still do it, but at least it can now be done on the client side natively through HTML. Tel is used to validate a telephone number, which could be useful. Number allows a number, and you can set a specific range, and it will only allow number input. Time allows the user to choose a time, so this would be useful if you're booking an appointment or something like that, right? Now all your data should be validated by the server-side script processing the form. I've mentioned this already, right? To make sure it hasn't been changed or tampered with after leaving the host. To do that, we need PHP. And you might be thinking, what is PHP? Hopefully you're thinking that, it's on the slide. So PHP originally stood for Personal Homepage, but it's now a recursive acronym that stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. It's a very widely used open source general purpose scripting language. That's very well suited and used for web development and can actually be embedded into HTML. That's how it works. Instead of lots of different commands to output HTML, like you will have seen if you've done any other web development or server-side scripting, PHP contains HTML, or sorry, PHP pages contain HTML with embedded code that does something. The code is enclosed in special start and end processing instructions. These tags here, I should have highlighted these so they'd stand out more. Angle bracket, question mark, PHP, and then closes with that. And that allows you to jump into PHP mode, do something, and then you're back to HTML mode. It's pretty handy. It's actually really great. I've used a couple server-side scripting languages. I like PHP a lot. Now, PHP has been around for a long time, which is partially why it's so popular as well. It was created in 1993. I'm not going to butcher this gentleman's name, but he's a Danish Canadian programmer, which is kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool. He's Canadian. Born in Denmark, but Canadian. It was first released in 1995. It's free, it's open source, and it's available cross-platform. It's a common element in a LAMP stack, which is a bundle of free and open source software that can be used to host web-based applications, plural. Now LAMP originally stood for Linux, which we've configured, right? Apache, which we've also configured in this course. MySQL, although it's been expanded to include MariaDB, MongoDB, and there's other database services that start with an M. And PHP, although it could also be Perl or Python. This is such a popular acronym that newer technologies that come along to replace a letter in the LAMP stack actually pick their name based on fulfilling that letter of the acronym. So it's really popular. Going to hear it at least once in industry. Probably more than once though. We'll have actually learned to configure 3 of the 4 components of this by the end of this week, because you're learning PHP now, and we've done some stuff with Linux and Apache. All you need is the database stuff, and that would be the contents of a whole nother course entirely. We're not going to do anything with databases in this course, as I've already said. I've mentioned it's popular. Just how popular is it? Well, it powers about 80% of the websites on the internet that we know about. We don't know, because it's a server-side scripting language, we don't know what powers every single website. But we know what powers some of them. That can be figured out. It's used by content management systems, or CMSs, like WordPress, MediaWiki, Joomla, Drupal, Moodle, they're all pretty popular. Also contributes to PHP's popularity. It's used by some companies like Facebook, Wikipedia, even WordPress.org, the WordPress website, is coded in PHP, which makes sense because their CMS is also coded in PHP. So, like, it's by far the most popular one. It's been around a long time. It's free, it's open source, it's available cross-platform. Is it the most trendy language for learning server-side scripting? No, but it is the most popular one by a large margin. So there's a pretty good chance you're going to encounter it if you get into web development and back-end web development more. So before you create your first PHP script, you have to install it. To do that, you're going to use the command sudo, because we need root privileges for that, right? And we're dealing with Ubuntu, which is Debian-based, so we're using apt. We haven't installed anything in a while, so a refresher is good. Apt install PHP. And once you've done that, you can start writing PHP scripts. PHP scripts go in document root, var www.html, just like your web pages, right? Just like your static web pages. The only difference is they end in the extension .php, and they contain some PHP code. And here's a sample PHP script that will print out hello world on the screen. So we see we have our opening PHP tag, we have our closing PHP tag, and then in here we have echo hello world semicolon. And that will print hello world on the screen. Now this is a sample. And you can use echo, or even, I believe there's a print command to print out text and even HTML tags. It's generally considered bad form because you're asking the server to do more work than it needs to do. Usually this stuff is just in HTML and it's interpreted by your browser. So the client just does that. The server just says, here's your page, figure it out. But when you're telling the server, no, I want you to print this out with echo, the server has to do a lot more work. Another drawback to doing it this way is any text formatting and stylizing that you're doing with HTML and CSS, that's just completely lost. It's useful for printing out the values of variables, however, which we're going to deal with this week. So it's a useful command, echo. Just don't print out HTML code with it. It's not good. Now, you might be familiar with variables in other languages because you may have learned programming sometime before being a student in my course. And they work basically the same in every language. But for those of you who don't know what they are, well, what's a variable? Variables are a named location in memory that you use to store a value in them. Now, the value can change over the course of a script or program. Kind of like when you use x or y as an unknown value in an equation in algebra. Unlike algebra, variables in programming are declared knowing how they're going to be used and what type of information that will be stored in them. PHP supports dynamic and static type variables. With dynamic type variables, the program determines what type of data is stored in the variable based on the context you're using it in. With static type variables, you have to declare the type when you define the variable, and that variable can then only store that type of data. It's more secure in a lot of ways, but it's more difficult to deal with. We're going to use dynamic variables because it's just simpler, and I prefer dynamic type variables anyway. I'm teaching this stuff, right? I'm not a programmer. My background is network administration. Just a network admin who learned how to program somewhat. It's recommended when using variables that you give them a meaningful name that reflect the intended purpose. Now, PHP doesn't have a command for declaring a variable. It's just created when you assign a value to it, which is handy. When you're creating variables in PHP, They always begin with a $sign, followed by the name of the variable. They can only begin with a letter or an underscore. They can be made up of letters, numbers, or underscores. You have to make sure that it's not a PHP reserved command word. That part can be a bit tricky. And they're case sensitive. So if you declare it with an uppercase somewhere in it, obviously not the first letter, right? Actually, I guess it could be the first letter. It has to be that case constantly. Now there's some recommendations for this too, some best practices. You should declare all of your variables at the top of your file, because it makes your life a lot easier. And don't use numbers. For example, date 1 versus date 2. What does it mean, right? Give it a meaningful name. So use something descriptive, like counter, or name, or price. And to make it even better, you might want to use camel case. This also helps you avoid using reserved command words, right? Camel case is a common practice where you take two words that describe what the variable is, and you capitalize the first letter, usually of the second word. Might be more than two words, right? So error counter, notice C is uppercase, or family name, capital N on name. Unit price discount, P and D are capitalized, right? I think you get the idea with camel case. Some people like it, some people hate it. It's a common practice that's out there. I do it. I think it makes sense. Here's an example. This example will initialize the variable name to Linus Torvalds and then print it out using variable substitution. So we have name equals Linus Torvalds, and notice each PHP statement ends in a semicolon. That's an important thing. And then to print it out, we just say echo name. The dot here will join these two strings together, and then created the Linux kernel, semicolon. This is going to print out Linus Torvalds created the Linux kernel on the screen. Notice the space here. When you're joining strings together, you can add space, or you're going to want to add space because it will join it and it'll just completely connect it, right? So you can add space to either string to put that space in there appropriately. And how do you figure out when to do this or where to do this? You play around with it. Now, when you submit the form using the method that you set in the opening tag, which is either going to be get or post, the information is then accessible using the appropriate global variable, which PHP calls a super global variable. And there's a couple of these. There's more than a couple, but the ones that we're going to look at this week, they're variables, so they start with $, underscore server, all in caps. That contains information about paths, headers, script locations, all kinds of useful stuff. $_ post, that's collects all the information that's submitted using the post method. And $_ get, you can probably guess already, right? Collects all the information when a form's submitted using the get method. There's a whole bunch more to super globals than this, but we're going to use two of these this week. We're going to use server and post. We're also going to use conditional logic, or if statements. Now the if statement, the if control structure, it's essential to programming and scripting. And it doesn't matter what language you're writing your code in, it works the same in every single language. The only thing that changes is the syntax. But it essentially means if whatever the condition you're checking for is met, do whatever the action is, or the code is that's contained within that block. Whatever code is contained in there will only execute if that condition is met. And you can have multiple if statements embedded using else if to check for multiple different things. You can also use else as a catch-all at the bottom, and that will be executed if none of the previous statements are met. You're going to be using an if statement this week to check if the form was submitted using the post method, by recalling that server global variable that we just talked about. And if it was, then you can start processing the form. And we're actually going to use it for a bit more than that. We're going to use it to validate as well. Here's our validation. Now, validating forms are complicated, and we're not going to go super deep into it. In fact, the validation we're doing in this week, I'm going to straight up tell you it's not good. It's not how you would do things, but it's simplified so you can learn the stuff, right? To validate a form, you use a combination of tools in conjunction with if statements to test data to see if they meet specific requirements. You're going to do really simple validation this week. You're just going to check and see if the field is not empty, and if it is, then the user submitted something so you can process the form. Now that's not sufficient validation for a production environment, because then you're going to get bad data in your database. So generally you want to make sure that not only is it not empty, but you need to cleanse it and sanity check it and make sure nobody's trying to do some weird cross-site scripting attack, and that they actually entered the data in the format that you wanted in. However, this is an introduction to PHP, and this is your final lab of the course, right? Next week we're going to start on assignment 2, and we're going to work on that for the rest of the semester. So that's good enough. If it's not empty, that's fine. We can build on that, or rather you can build on that later if you want to learn more at PHP on your own. I'm just giving you kind of an introduction here. So I've given you a code sample here, and I've included some comments. Comments in PHP begin with a pound. There's actually a couple other ways of doing them, but that's the one that I tend to use because it's a lot like bash in that regard. So this code here will check to see if the first name input field is empty. And if it is, it will set a meaningful error and set the validation flag to false. So if we got our round brackets empty, post, we're checking that post super global, f name, if it's empty, right? Then store an error message for the error that we're going to display and set our validation field to false. Now this error message would be echoed out in the form lower, usually beside the box where you're entering the data. So in Lab 10, you're going to prepare your web server to execute PHP scripts. You're going to build an HTML form to collect your data. You're going to use different types of input fields. You're going to be able to describe the PHP syntax because you're going to use it a bit. We're going to use variables, and we're going to parse a form and validate it using a script. Next week, you're going to configure GitHub Pages, and you're going to learn how to automatically deploy a website from a GitHub repository. We're not going to do the custom domain name because there were issues getting that to work. Not that it doesn't work, it does work, it just doesn't work in our particular use case, so we're just pretend that doesn't exist. And for assignment 2, you're going to plan, develop, and deploy a new website from GitHub without a server, just using GitHub Pages. Hopefully that sounds awesome. We'll talk about that next week. Take care, be safe. I will see you in the lab demonstration video. Bye for now.